Well, good morning. I'm glad that you are here. We are just going to continue our study of the life of this Old Testament king named Hezekiah. And as I told you the first week that we started to pay attention to his life, we are after far more than spiritual autobiography. We are ultimately trying to develop a vision of what it would look like for us individually and for us as a church to rely on God, not to just settle for some vague sense that, sure, I think God is trustworthy, but like, what would it look like for us to cultivate the kind of lives where we are relying on God for specific things in our families, in our marriage, that we are relying on God for specific things as we pursue his mission of restoration in this city. And Hezekiah becomes an incredible example of what it looks like to live that kind of life. And he does it in the face of extraordinary challenge. He comes to the throne of Jerusalem, Judea, when he is 25 years old, and it is a time of significant political upheaval. The Assyrian Empire is threatening. The Babylonians are on the rise, and he is presiding over a significantly diminished population because the northern tribes of Israel have been taken into captivity by the Assyrians. He comes to the throne in a moment of national crisis. But as we talked about last week, before he starts engaging in any kind of civil reform, before he starts dealing with any of the geopolitical intrigue that's waiting for him, he calls Israel to a season of spiritual renewal. He understands that if they are actually going to live in reliance on God in the face of real challenges, that they needed to get some things right in their relationship with God, and they needed to get some things right in their own hearts. And we said, hey, we wanted to go with Israel in pursuing that season of spiritual revitalization as a local church. So last week we talked about the fact that Hezekiah called together the Levites and the priests, and he asked them to consecrate themselves and to consecrate the temple, to reopen the doors of the temple that had been closed by his father Ahaz, and to make the priesthood ritually clean again as a way of saying we want to be the people of God and we want to set ourselves apart for use by God. That's the heart behind the prayer gathering that we're going to have this coming Saturday at 7 p.m. I understand it's not a perfect time for everybody, but if you're available on Saturday night, a group of us have decided to get together and to pray around this idea of consecrating ourselves to God, and we'd love to have you be a part of that. You can get more information in the lobby. But what I want us to see today is that Hezekiah doesn't just have this moment where a group of spiritual people kind of cleanse and purify themselves and say, okay, good, now let's get busy dealing with the challenges of the day. There's one more thing that he wants to have happen to ensure that Israel is in the place that they need to be spiritually. And it's what we just heard read for us out of 2 Chronicles chapter 30. He reinstitutes the Passover. Right? For the king and his officials and the entire congregation in Jerusalem decided to observe the Passover of the Lord in the second month. That's the second month of the calendar year, because they were not able to observe it at the appropriate time. Passover was supposed to be celebrated in the first month of the year, but all of the things that we looked at last week, all of the consecrating of the priests, all of the opening of the temple, all of the ridding the temple of idols and impurities, all of that was happening during the first month. So they weren't able to celebrate Passover at the prescribed time, right? Here it is, not enough of the priests had consecrated themselves, and the people hadn't been gathered together in Jerusalem. The priests weren't ready, and the people weren't there, so they decided to push it off to the second month. Now, I want you to see this is something that is very spiritually intentional that Hezekiah is doing. Right, this is not just the equivalent of like, well, look, none of the kids could make it back for Christmas in the end of December, so we're just celebrating in January and kind of having to like unofficial makeup, and we are trusting that Jesus is still honored by that. Numbers chapter 9 actually contained specific plans of what was to happen if Israel was not in a place where they could celebrate the Passover when they were supposed to. And according to that whole ritual, if you couldn't do it in the first month of the year, there was this whole officially prescribed backup plan to do it in the second month of the year. And everything that's outlined in Numbers chapter 9, Hezekiah follows to a T. Right? So there is intentionality and significance to every single thing that he does. He wants Israel to get back to observing the Passover. Now, the key to understand is that this is about more than Hezekiah just being a rule follower. This is about more than Hezekiah just saying, hey, look, guys, we're supposed to do it. We haven't been doing it. Let's go back to doing it, and assuming that that would just be satisfactory in and of itself. Hezekiah sees the reinstitution of Passover as a way for Israel to renew their relationship with God and for Israel to pursue spiritual renewal in their own lives. 2 Chronicles chapter 30, verse 6. He invites not just the people in the southern kingdom of Judah, but also those in the northern kingdom of Israel to return to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, so that he may return to those of you who remain, who have escaped the grasp of the kings of Assyria. Remember, the northern kingdom has been conquered by the Assyrians, and many of the leaders and the elites have been taken into exile, but there were still Jewish people living in that area, and he is inviting those people, along with those in the southern kingdom of Judah, to come back and celebrate the Passover, but he's inviting them to return to the Lord so that the Lord would return to them. There is this sense in Hezekiah that the failure to observe Passover has significantly dishonored God, but there is also this sense that the failure to observe Passover has robbed Israel of the spiritual vitality that they need to face the challenges of the day. And as soon as I say that, I think you would be able to see the relevance of this conversation to our lives today. Because just to get it out early in the sermon, we no longer observe Passover, right? Which is a little bit of a trick in terms of like, how do you preach an entire passage about Passover to a group of people who no longer observe Passover? By the way, there is nothing in the New Testament that would require us not to observe Passover. It's more church tradition. And I would say if you ever get the chance to get invited to a Seder meal, you should absolutely take it, because you will be astonished at how much that observance of Passover points to Jesus and encourages your faith in the gospel. But at the end of the day, it is not something that the Christian church observes on an annual basis. However, I think we can all track with this idea of feeling like we don't necessarily have the spiritual vitality that we need to meet the challenges of our day. The challenges of our day are different. There is not a conquering army on our border getting ready to sweep in. Yet I think we all have this sense that we are struggling to find spiritual intimacy with God in a nonstop 24/7 culture of email and evening work and kids' soccer schedules and all kinds of other things. I think we have a sense that to cling to faith in Jesus and to live life the way that Jesus would call us to live life means that you have decided to live as a countercultural witness in a city that is increasingly drifting, not just from God, but from any semblance of following God. Right? That if we are to take our calling as ambassadors of Christ seriously, we know that it's going to be an uphill battle. And I think it's safe to say that many of us look at that battle and we feel a sense of weariness. We look at that battle and we wonder, how much longer can I keep going? We look at that battle and wonder, is there someplace else in the country that we could live where it would be easier, where it wouldn't feel like it's quite this hard, where there's just this sense that we want the best for ourselves, we want the best for our friends, we want the best for our spouse and our kids, but we're just tired. In other words, we are very much in the place where the people of God were in Hezekiah's day. And he says, guys, would you just go with me? What if we got back to doing the things that we used to do that nurtured our souls? What if, instead of allowing ourselves to be drowned by the demands and the pressures of the day, what if we became a community of people that intentionally prioritized the things that nurture our soul? So not Passover for us, but things that are as day-to-day as prayer and reading the scriptures. Not Passover for us, but things that provide rhythm to our week, like gathering on a Sunday to worship God and hear from Him in His Word and meet with Him around a different table, this time a table with bread and wine that reminds us of what God has done for us. Not Passover for us, but different seasons like Advent and Lent that call us to a renewed devotion to God, the things that our souls need. Different practices, but the same need. And my goal for today is not to stand up here and walk us through a laundry list of the things that we should be doing. Most of us know the things that we should be doing. Right? If you have questions about that, your community group leader would love to talk about that this week. There's other people here who would love to help lead you in what those practices look like. But Israel knew they were supposed to be observing Passover. Hezekiah wasn't stunning them with this announcement that he wanted to do Passover. They knew it. They just weren't doing it. He was taking the risk of saying, hey guys, what if rather than just acknowledging like, yeah, I know I'm supposed to, like what if we actually did it? What if we actually cared for our souls? What would it do in terms of our ability to face the challenges of our day? So this is one of those days where I'm thinking you're going to be able to apply the text to your life in whatever way you need to. But what I would like for us all to be able to do is to spend a few minutes looking at the spiritual benefits that come through the regular observance of practices, festivals, moments with God that actually nurture our souls. So I think as we walk through this list, we'll all say, oh, I could use a little bit of that. And maybe God would build that desire in each of us to the point where we would end up making some changes in our schedules and making some changes in the way that we approach certain things. Because when Israel decides to observe the Passover, they find hope through remembrance. Again, I'm just assuming it's a given that we could all use a little bit of hope. What we may not be as familiar with is that Passover was intended to be an annual reminder of what God had done in leading Israel out of slavery in Egypt, right? That Israel is enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. God hears the cry of his people. He raises up Moses and Aaron to lead them from slavery to freedom. It's at the cost of 10 plagues that are necessary to ultimately soften the heart of Pharaoh, the last of those 10 plagues being the worst, because all of the firstborn in Egypt were going to die on one night, except for the firstborn of Israel, who were going to go through a ritual to indicate that they were the ones who were trusting in Yahweh. But as a result of what happens that night, the people of God go free. They wander for 40 years in the desert, but ultimately enter the promised land and ultimately enter a season of spiritual vitality with God as they build a temple, and there is a dwelling place for the Almighty in the presence of the people of God. And what God knew is that despite the fact that he had miraculously freed his people from slavery, despite the fact that he had miraculously parted the Red Sea, despite the fact that he had led them with a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud, despite the fact that he had rained provision from the heavens, despite all of that, they were going to forget his power. They were going to forget his grace. And listen, if you forget the power and the grace of God, you'll never be able to actually rely on God, because you'll never believe that he's strong enough to do anything about the problems of your life, and you'll never believe that he's loving enough to want to do something about the power of your life. So if we jump back to Exodus chapter 12, the first Passover, we see in verse 14 that this day, this celebration of Passover is to be a memorial for you, as it says in the CSB translation. If you were to look at the same passage in the NRSV or several other translations, it will say that this day shall be a day of remembrance for you. And you must celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. You are to celebrate it throughout your generations as a permanent statute. This is going to be a part of your annual calendar, because you're going to set aside a day just to remember what it is that God had done. That every subsequent Passover was designed to be an annual reminder of what had happened that night when the God of heaven had fought for the freedom of his people. And that moment was marked by a meal. Exodus chapter 12, verse 6 through 11. This is the instruction for the first Passover. They were told a little bit earlier in Exodus 12 to get a lamb on the 10th day of the first month. And they kept that lamb for 4 days, and we pick up the story in verse 6. You are to keep it, that's the lamb, until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembly of the community of Israel will slaughter the animals at twilight. They must take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel, the part that goes across the top of the houses where they eat them. They are to eat the meat that night. They should eat it, roast it over the fire, along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or cooked in boiling water, but only roasted over fire. Its head as well as its legs and inner organs. You must not leave any of it until morning. Any part of it left until morning you must burn. Here's how you must eat it. You must be dressed for travel, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand. You are to eat it in a hurry. It is the Lord's Passover. God is almost shockingly precise about what he expects that first Passover. I mean, he almost comes across as sort of this like divine micromanager who's like, inviting people over for dinner, but he's like, look, we're going to keep our shoes on. We're going to eat quickly. Here's how we're going to do it. Don't worry. I have a plan for the leftovers. I mean, there is something incredibly specific going on in each moment of this Passover. One of the things that's going on is that God is creating this multi-sensory experience for Israel through unleavened bread and the aroma of roasted meat and through bitter herbs, things that Israel will be able to come back to year after year after year, to taste and see the goodness of God, to be reminded this really happened. We're not just sitting around rehearsing a spiritual story. We're following in the footsteps of our spiritual ancestors who ate with a cloak on, who didn't sit and luxuriously enjoy good food, but were ready to go because God was ready to deliver them. And God was saying to his people, you are going to be tempted to forget it. And I want you to remember. I want you to remember the day that I fought for you. And what's so interesting when you read the Old Testament is how often Israel failed to follow that clear instruction. If you were to put together any kind of timeline of like, okay, from the night of that first Passover through Hezekiah's reign, or frankly, from the night of that first Passover to the coming of Jesus, how often was Israel observing the Passover versus how often are they not? The vast majority of the time, they don't. Like way more than 50%. Right? 2 Chronicles 30, verse 5 alludes to that. For they hadn't observed it often as prescribed. There was this thing that God had called them to do that they were too busy for, that they thought was a nice idea, but not like strictly required. Cute religious tradition, but not something that fit with their modern lifestyle. I don't know. And certainly I don't want to be too hard on them because we all struggle with the same things in our lives. We have the same propensity to forget. Right, on the night that Jesus celebrates Passover with his disciples, before going to offer himself as the Lamb of God, he takes bread and he takes a cup. He creates another multi-sensory experience around a table. He says, I want you to do this, and when you do it, I want you to remember me. It is this spiritually insightful and deeply human moment. Can you imagine being the Son of God? You left heaven and came to earth. You've lived a perfect life. You're at a meal with the 12 people who were closest to you. Obviously, one of them has some issues, but these are your guys. And you're there. And you're celebrating the Passover, knowing that the whole thing points to you. Yet you pick up bread and you say, this is representing my body. It's going to be broken for you and for the sin of the world. Could you please just remember me? Don't forget me. I know you're going to be busy. I know you have a lot going on. I know there's things coming that you can't even imagine. Can you just remember me? It's like touchingly sad. It's touchingly human. Hey guys, I'm going to go die for you tomorrow. Please don't forget. But it also speaks to the need of our souls because we so easily forget. Israel so easily forgets. And I don't think that they're bad and wicked people. I think they would just find themselves getting busy. I think they would find themselves doing things like, Passover. Yeah, of course, like super important. God, Red Sea. Man, that's why we're free. That's why we're in Jerusalem today. But dude, I'm in Jerusalem today. I mean, granted, if it wasn't for Passover, I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't own this business today, but I am here and I do own this business and I have employees and I have demands and I have things I have to do. So absolutely Passover, but I don't have time for like the full deal. Because ultimately, Passover turns into a 7-day festival where it's like, come on, I just can't do that. That just doesn't work for me anymore. So they were tempted to gloss over it. And because they glossed over it, they forgot who their God really was. They forgot his power. They forgot his grace. So no wonder in this moment of forgetfulness that they look at the Assyrians and tremble. They look at the Assyrians and say, Hezekiah, you need to go cut a deal on our behalf. We're going under. It's just a question of how bad and how bloody it's going to be. And Hezekiah is like, yeah, guys, we need to find some hope through the remembrance of what God has done in the past. We need to look at the fact that God led us out of slavery in Egypt, and we need to allow ourselves to believe that he might very well do the same thing in our day today. Right? That's what we need. We need to come to a table with bread and wine and remember what Jesus did on our behalf. And think, well, but wait a minute, if he was willing to die for me, isn't it possible that he's up to the challenges of my day? We know it, but we forget it. But if we will remember it, we will find hope. Now, what's interesting about this is Passover was designed to be a distinctly communal celebration. And obviously, do I think we can find hope through private remembrance? Absolutely. But there is a joy that can only be found in the context of community. And when I talk about joy, I want you to see exactly what unfolds a little bit later in 2 Chronicles chapter 30, picking it up in verse 21. The Israelites who were present in Jerusalem observed the festival of unleavened bread 7 days with great joy. So these are the people that took Hezekiah's invitation, came to Jerusalem, were like, man, we're in. We want to remember. We want to trust God for the strength we need to meet the challenges of our day. And they experienced great joy. The Levites, the priests, praised the Lord day after day with loud instruments. Then Hezekiah encouraged all the Levites who performed skillfully before the Lord, right? Everybody who comes up on this stage to lead us is not just performing for our spiritual benefit. They are leading us in worship to God, right? Leading us in praise, leading us in a spiritual sacrifice. But as all this singing is happening and all this worship is unfolding, they ate at the appointed festival for 7 days, sacrificing fellowship offerings and giving thanks to the Lord, the God of their ancestors. The whole congregation, check this out, decided to observe 7 more days. They go through an entire week. They're like, that was awesome. Let's do it again. All right, it's like my secret dream for a church service where everyone's like, dude, let's just do it again. That was awesome. Let's see, where we go the second time. They're like, man, I gotta, you know what? I didn't think I had 7 days, but man, wow, this is what I needed. In fact, I can find another 7 days for this. Wouldn't it be great if we were to experience the same thing in moments of prayer, time with God and his word, when we come together, where we're like, man, I need more of that. So they observed 7 days with joy. King Hezekiah of Judah contributes 1,000 bulls and 7,000 sheep for the congregation. They wouldn't have had the provision that they needed for an extra 7 days. And in a picture of grace, Hezekiah's like, don't worry, I got you covered. Also, the officials contributed another 1,000 bulls and 10,000 sheep for the congregation, and many priests consecrated themselves. I'm all about private devotion. I'm all about private rhythms where we're able to get alone with God. You need it and I need it, and you need it more often than you think, and it's worth waking up early in the morning for. Don't buy it. The extra 20 minutes of sleep is not going to do as much as 20 minutes in the presence of God. If you want to find strength for the challenges of your world, you got to figure out how to get alone with God. It's not optional. You got to figure it out. At the same time, there is something unique that happens when we come together to worship, where we come together to celebrate, where we come together to remember, because we are reminded that we're not the only one who still believes this stuff. We're not the only one who is still trying to live this way. We're not the only one pursuing the kingdom of God right in the middle of Washington, D.C. We're not the only one who wants more than what the world has to offer. We're not the only ones crazy to believe that by the grace of God, we are now alive forever. And we live in a world that's like, that's crazy. You believe in fairy tales and myths. And then we come together on Sunday and we're like, wait, but I'm not alone. And it's not a fairy tale. It's not a myth. And we see friends and we see people that we respect and we see people that we look up to and we see people that have borne our burdens and people that we've been able to bear burdens for, people that we know the highs and lows of their life, and we find a little bit of strength in that. Find a little bit of joy in that. Private devotion, absolutely, but there is also a joy to be found in community. So we need to cultivate these patterns of remembrance in our lives. We need to do it individually and we need to do it collectively. But I think there's a fear in me as we get to the end of the talk. And it's a fear that says, man, yeah, I get it. Return to the Lord, that he could return to you. Yeah, I got to get back to doing the things that I once used to do. Yeah, it's time to engage and nurture my soul and do all this stuff. But John, I mean, I get it. And for a lot of people, maybe they can just take this and run with it. But man, I am so messed up that I don't think this could apply to me. Right, I'm so far gone, I just don't know that I can get in on this. I mean, I love the idea. I see the need. But the problems in my life are really substantial. And the challenges are really significant. And I get it that a whole bunch of people find joy when they come together in this place on Sunday. But I think there's some of us that feel like, look, if everybody in the room knew who you actually were, knew what you actually had done this week, knew your full story, that you would not be welcome here. That you would somehow need to go figure some stuff out, work some things out, get your act together, go to some sort of remedial program somewhere, and then you could come back. But look, that's never the heart of God. I pray it's never the heart of our church. I don't believe it is. But I want you to see that when Hezekiah invites the nation to return to God, when he throws the doors of the temple wide open, he hopes, he prays, he believes that there are going to be people that are coming that are so messed up that they don't believe that they should be there. He's not issuing a call for saints. He's opening the door to the temple for sinners. And he goes to great lengths to make sure that everybody that comes that day would be able to taste the grace and mercy of God. Right? If we go all the way back to the beginning of the passage, verse 1, Hezekiah sends word throughout all Israel and Judea, a divided kingdom, but he goes to both the northern and the southern kingdom. And he writes letters to Ephraim and Manasseh to come to the Lord's temple, two tribes that were particularly rebellious, to observe the Passover. And he does it with a reminder in verse 9, the Lord your God is gracious and merciful. He will not turn his face away from you if you return to him. And for some of us, the spiritual challenge for today is you just have to figure out if you believe that the cross of Jesus Christ is big enough for the promise of 2 Chronicles 30, verse 9 to apply to you. Hezekiah was confident that the grace and mercy of God was greater than whatever had happened. Right? So they invite everybody. The message goes throughout Israel, even though the Passover had been neglected. And these messengers are just going out. And they're inviting everybody they can see. And they're delivering letters written by the hand of the king. And they're like, would you just come? Would you just taste that God is good? Would you taste that God is gracious? And verse 10 tells us that there were a lot of people that mocked those messengers. There were a lot of people that were like, yeah, I'm good. Thank you. Don't need God. Don't want God. No, man, I can't believe that God would want me. I'm not coming. So, this isn't some sort of, fairy tale where it's like, oh, and everybody that was invited showed up. No, that's not true to real life. But everybody that did show up, there was provision for him that day. Verse 16, the priests splattered the blood received from the Levites, and there were many in this assembly who had not consecrated themselves. That means that according to the Jewish law, they shouldn't have been there. They were unclean, impure, they were sinners, they were broken, they'd done a bunch of bad stuff and hadn't gotten it right with God. There were many there. Not just like a little footnote and like, oh, and, Fred showed up and he's a problem. It's like, no, there's a whole bunch of people showed up. The Levites were in charge of slaughtering the Passover lambs for every unclean person to consecrate the lambs to the Lord. A large number of the people, many from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun, were ritually unclean, yet they had eaten the Passover contrary to what is written. But Hezekiah, check this part out, had it interceded for them, saying, may the good Lord provide atonement on behalf of whoever sets his whole heart on seeking God, the Lord, the God of his ancestors, even though not according to the purification rules of the sanctuary. So the Lord heard Hezekiah and healed the people. He throws the door open and he's like, you're a mess, you're broke, you haven't done I get it, I got you covered. I've been praying for you. I've offered sacrifices on your behalf. He's standing there and he's saying, hey God, I know they're not supposed to be in your presence, but would you accept the sacrifice that I'm going to offer on their behalf so that you would not have to judge them for being there, but that they could experience your grace and your mercy? And God buys it. And if God buys Hezekiah offering a sacrifice on behalf of the broken, how much more do you think God buys it when Jesus offers himself as the sacrifice on behalf of the broken? See, your hope in life and my hope in life is not a good king or a noble priest who's going to go offer a lamb on our behalf. Your hope in life and my hope in life is a good king who became a high priest and offered his body on our behalf. So that the doors, not just of the temple, but the doors of the kingdom of heaven could be thrown open. And we could say, whoever you are, whatever you've done, no matter how unclean you think you are, no matter how impure, how broken, how much you shouldn't be here, guess what? It's fine. Come in and experience the joy of the kingdom of heaven. Come celebrate in community. Come taste the grace and mercy of God. Come remember what God has done and find the strength that you need to live today because Jesus has offered himself on our behalf. That's the invitation. That's the hope. That, yeah, we would prioritize the things that remind us of that. Oh, but we would allow our souls to feel the benefit of it. All of our English translations talk about observing the Passover. And that's good, and that's right, but that's an English translation of a Hebrew verb, ashah. And ashah translates a number of different ways. Observe is very, very rarely one of them. It more literally translates do this, make this. Not just be aware, not be distant, like actually immerse yourself in this. That's the invitation for all of our lives. It's the invitation when the alarm goes off tomorrow and you get to decide if you want to spend time with God or do something else. But it's also the invitation as we come to a table and take communion. Are we willing to immerse ourselves in a story of grace and mercy that will satisfy the longing of our soul and will give us the strength we need to meet the challenge of our day? So, Father in heaven, we want to come to you now and we want to ask that you would meet us here. God, our desire is to return to you. Our desire is to taste and see that you are good. Our desire is to draw near to you. And Lord, our hope in this moment is that you will draw near to us as we draw near to you. Our hope in this moment is that you will return to us, that you will give us faith to believe the promises of the gospel. So, Lord, I very simply ask that in a few moments of silence, you would draw near to each of us now. Help us open ourselves to you, God. We pray in Jesus' name.